Her millionaire husband called her ugly and cheated, but what she did next proved she was far stronger than he ever imagined. A timeless story of a powerful woman. Don't miss the ending, my beautiful family. Hi, my beautiful, loyal and great family. I am Mr. Peter, always with you in love. Welcome my new family members who are joining me. First time, I love you and God bless you, Almighty God. Bless my family listening now. Give peace to their homes, strength to their hearts, and endless love to my precious sisters, mothers and daughters. Cover them with mercy and joy. Amen. My family, I don't write for views, I write for you. Every story comes from my heart. But when many leave halfway, it hurts, as if my hard work means nothing. Still, I promise to always give my best. My strength is Binta, who changed me with her love and wisdom. And to my new family members, don't judge me too quickly. Ask my old family. They know Mr. Peter never cheats your heart. I've also created a new channel, Mr. Peter Family, with shorter stories under 1 hour. You can find the link in my community post. Please subscribe and stay with me till the end. If your heart is true, write present. If your love is real, write I am with Mr. Peter. Some words cut deeper than any knife, and some mirrors reflect more than just your appearance. They reveal the monstrous truth about the person standing beside you. Rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Tribeca penthouse, creating a melancholic symphony that would forever be the soundtrack to Sophie Stubbs's destruction. Nothing could have prepared her for the crescendo of cruelty about to shatter her world beyond repair. Look at yourself, Sophie. The words dripped venom as Corbin Stubbs positioned himself behind his wife at their bedroom mirror, his reflection radiating disgust. Sophie's hands shook as she smoothed the black dress, the same one she'd worn to 3 events this month because nothing else fit since the miscarriage. You are ugly. No man would ever truly desire you. I only married you for convenience. The mirror revealed everything, Sophie's eyes filling with tears, her husband's contemptuous sneer, the extra weight that grief and medication had added to her frame. What it couldn't show was her heart splintering into fragments too small to ever rebuild. Corbin Stubbs commanded Manhattan's real estate empire, 47 million at 35, with razor-sharp features and Arctic blue eyes that made socialites swoon at charity galas. He controlled half of Tribeca's prime properties, his influence stretching from the financial district to Park Avenue penthouses. Sophie had been his Columbia sweetheart, the scholarship girl from Long Island who'd balanced business classes with 3 part-time jobs. Back then, she'd believed in happily ever after, trusted that love could conquer anything, imagined her ambitious boyfriend would treasure her always. 7 years of marriage had murdered those dreams, one calculated cruelty at a time. I'm trying, Corbin, Sophie whispered, barely audible above the storm. The doctor said it's normal after losing... After what? After you failed to give me an heir? His laugh sliced through the air. Madison doesn't make excuses. Madison takes care of herself. Madison Davis. The name struck like a physical blow. 28, blonde, blessed with a trust fund worth millions and a body that graced Society magazine covers. Sophie had suspected for months, noticed the secretive calls, the unexplained absences, the way Corbin's attention wandered at parties. Don't speak her name in our bedroom, Sophie said, discovering strength she'd forgotten she possessed. Our bedroom? Corbin whirled to face her, his tailored Tom Ford suit immaculate despite the late hour. This is my penthouse, my bedroom, bought with my money. You exist here because I permit it. Thunder crashed outside, echoing the tempest building in Sophie's chest. She watched this man, who'd once promised to love her through sickness and health, check his platinum Rolex with the indifference he'd show a panhandler. I have an engagement, he announced, straightening his tie. Madison's hosting dinner for her father's partners. Critical networking. It's nearly midnight on a Thursday. Success doesn't follow a clock, darling. Neither does ambition. He snatched his keys from the marble nightstand. Try to improve your appearance before Mother's charity luncheon Saturday. You're becoming an embarrassment. The door slammed with brutal finality, leaving Sophie alone with her shattered reflection. She stared at the woman she'd become, 30 years old, hollow-eyed, drowning in fabric that had once fit perfectly before grief transformed her body. The sharp analyst who'd once commanded boardrooms had withered into a ghost of herself. Something compelled her toward Corbyn's nightstand. His backup phone, the one he assumed remained secret, lay charging beneath architectural blueprints. Sophie's fingers trembled as she lifted it. The messages painted a devastating picture. Madison, miss you already, baby. Wear that cologne I love. Corbyn, Sophie's at book club until 10. I can stay late. Madison, when do we go public? Daddy's lawyer is Manhattan's finest. Corbyn, soon. Need to handle the financial complications first. Her family's construction contracts are too valuable to risk. Madison, I'm tired of hiding, darling. I want to be Mrs. Corbyn Stubbs. Corbyn, patience, love. Once I dispose of the fat cow, we'll honeymoon in the Maldives, somewhere she could never follow. The phone slipped from Sophie's numb fingers, its screen fracturing against marble, spiderwebs that perfectly mirrored her marriage. She drifted to their walk-in closet, past suits worth more than teacher salaries, past shoes that could fund charities. Hidden behind winter coats was her emergency bag, packed during their first major fight 3 years ago, but never used for lack of courage. Inside, passport, credit cards in her maiden name, cash, legal documents. Also concealed was Corbyn's greatest oversight, her grandmother's trust fund papers, $2.3 million protected by airtight legal structures he'd never bothered investigating. Sophie changed into jeans and a sweater, her movements mechanical but purposeful. She gathered only essentials, leaving behind the material prison that had defined her identity. At the last moment, she removed her wedding ring, 3 carats that had once symbolized eternal love, and placed it beside a note written on his monogrammed stationery. You wanted ordinary gone. Congratulations. The elevator descended through floors of broken dreams. Her Range Rover would remain, another symbol of dependence she was abandoning. Instead, she called a taxi from the lobby, directing the driver to a Queens address Corbyn would never think to search. Manhattan's skyline receded like a discarded painting as Sophie Stubbs planned her metamorphosis. When she returned, and she would return, it wouldn't be as the broken woman fleeing into darkness. It would be as someone who could make him experience every ounce of pain he'd inflicted. The taxi driver studied her in his mirror. Everything all right, miss? You look like you've seen a ghost. Sophie wiped away her final tear for Corbyn Stubbs and smiled genuinely for the first time in months. No, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. I think I just buried one. But what Corbyn didn't know was that Sophie had a secret trust fund and 6 months to plan the perfect revenge. Chapter 2. The Disappearance. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but sometimes it's worth waiting for it to freeze into something that can shatter a man's entire world. 6 months, 183 days since Corbyn Stubbs had discovered that vacant space where his wife's wedding ring once lived on their nightstand, and still the sight made his chest constrict with emotions he refused to acknowledge as regret. Mr. Stubbs, we've exhausted every lead. Detective James Rodriguez settled into the leather chair across from Corbyn's mahogany desk, his weathered hands folded over a case file grown embarrassingly thin. Your wife Sophie has vanished without a trace. No credit card activity, no cell phone signals, no verified sightings. She's disappeared completely. Corbyn reclined in his chair, Manhattan's skyline sprawling beyond windows that had cost more than suburban homes. 26 floors below, the city thrived with relentless energy, but up here, everything felt suffocating. Her family? Corbin asked, though he dreaded the answer. Robert and Helen Smith maintain they haven't heard from her. Same with Sister Margaret in Boston. Either they're protecting her or... Rodriguez shrugged. Perhaps she genuinely doesn't want to be found. The detective left unspoken what everyone suspected. Maybe Sophie had excellent reasons for vanishing. Patricia Chen, Corbin's secretary, knocked before entering, a privilege earned through 8 years of managing his increasingly chaotic existence. "Your mother's here, Mr. Stubbs. She appears distressed." Before Corbin could respond, Eleanor Stubbs swept in like an approaching hurricane, her silver hair immaculately styled despite obvious agitation. At 62, she dominated every space she entered, a force who'd raised Corbin to be ruthless in business and charming in society. Today, she looked ready for war. "Detective Rodriguez, thank you for your efforts. Please excuse us," she commanded with icy authority. Rodriguez gathered his files efficiently. "I'll continue searching, Mr. Stubbs, but after 6 months, you should consider that your wife may prefer staying lost." The door's soft click left Corbin facing the woman who'd taught him everything about power and who'd apparently learned disturbing truths about how he'd chosen to abuse it. Corbin Michael Stubbs. Eleanor's voice could have frozen champagne. "I just endured the most enlightening lunch with Helen Smith." Terror gripped Corbin's throat. Sophie's mother and his mother had maintained friendship for decades, bonding over charity work and shared hopes for grandchildren that would never exist. "Mother, let me explain." "Explain?" Eleanor's laugh could shatter crystal. "Explain how you destroyed the finest woman who ever loved you. Explain how you humiliated someone who worshipped you completely. Explain how you made my dearest friend weep into her salad while recounting what kind of monster I raised." Each word struck like artillery fire. Corbin had witnessed his mother's anger before, when he'd wrecked her Bentley at 17, when he'd abandoned Harvard Business School for 6 months of European soul-searching. But this transcended anything he'd experienced. Sophie was fragile, Corbin protested weakly. She couldn't handle our lifestyle demands. She gained weight, stopped maintaining herself. "She lost your baby, you soulless bastard." Eleanor's composure shattered completely. "She miscarried your child, and instead of comforting her, you pursued that blonde parasite while making Sophie feel worthless." The intercom buzzed sharply. "Mr. Stubbs," Patricia's voice carried careful neutrality. "Ms. Davis has arrived for your lunch meeting." Eleanor's eyes turned predatory. "Perfect. Send her up. I'm eager to meet the woman who destroyed my son's marriage." "Mother, please don't..." "Don't what?" "Don't acknowledge that you discarded a woman who supported your dreams before you possessed a penny. Don't recognize that you're dating a child who only wants your bank account." Madison Davis entered like she owned the building, all designer legs and practiced confidence. Her platinum hair caught afternoon sunlight through the windows, her smile radiating the artificial warmth of someone who'd never questioned her welcome. "Eleanor, how delightful seeing you again," Madison chirped, apparently oblivious to the Arctic atmosphere. "Madison!" Eleanor's tone could have wilted roses. "I was just departing. Corbin, we'll finish this conversation later, at home, where Sophie used to belong." The door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows. Madison gracefully claimed Rodriguez's vacated chair, crossing her legs with practiced elegance. "Your mother seems stressed. Perhaps she needs a spa retreat. Daddy always says tension ages women terribly." Corbin barely registered her words. His mind was calculating losses he was only beginning to comprehend. Eleanor's disapproval was personally devastating, but the business implications were catastrophic. Eleanor controlled the Stubbs family trust that had funded his initial developments. Without her support, his credit was already contracting. "Corbin," Hello. Madison waved manicured fingers before his face. I asked when we're announcing our engagement officially. The Whitneys are hosting their autumn gala next month and I need to order my ring. Ring? Corbin struggled to focus. Madison, we've discussed this. The divorce isn't finalized. Divorce is irrelevant. Sophie's gone. She won't return. Madison's voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who'd never faced real consequences. Besides, Daddy's attorneys say 6 months of abandonment provides grounds for divorce. We could marry by Christmas. Something twisted in Corbin's chest. Christmas. He remembered last year, Sophie making her grandmother's pancakes while wearing his Columbia shirt, her hair messy from sleep, laughing at his terrible jokes. She'd been luminous then, beautiful in ways that transcended makeup or designer clothes. I need time to think, Corbin said. Madison's perfect smile wavered. Think about what? We've planned this for months. The intercom buzzed again. Mr. Stubbs, William Anderson is here. He says it's urgent. William Anderson entered like a man bearing catastrophic news, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by grim concern. At 55, he'd mentored Corbin for a decade, helping build Stubbs' development into Manhattan's premier real estate firm. Madison, would you excuse us? William's tone was polite but inflexible. Actually, Madison should hear this, Corbin said, surprising himself. If we're marrying, she should understand the business. William's expression darkened further. Corbin, we need privacy. Just tell me, William. Fine. William slammed a folder onto the desk. Morrison project is dead. They're withdrawing completely. Brooklyn development investors want an emergency meeting to reassess their position. The city's affordable housing contract has been mysteriously delayed. Blood drained from Corbin's face. Those 3 projects represented over $200 million in potential revenue. That's impossible. Morrison was guaranteed. Was past tense? William's voice carried unfamiliar weight. Apparently, they have concerns about organizational stability. Meaning what? William glanced meaningfully at Madison, then back at Corbin. Meaning someone with serious influence has been making strategic calls. Someone determined to see Stubbs' development collapse. Silence filled the room except for Manhattan's distant traffic hum 26 floors below. Madison stood abruptly, clutching her designer bag with white knuckles. I should leave. Daddy expects me for dinner. She kissed Corbin's cheek again, but this time it felt calculated, cold. Call when you've resolved this mess, darling. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. After her departure, William poured himself scotch from Corbin's bar without permission, something unprecedented in 10 years of partnership. Want to explain what really happened with Sophie? William asked quietly. She left. That's everything. Bullshit. William's voice was soft but adamant. Sophie Smith was the most brilliant woman I've known. She's also the only person who made you act human instead of like a spreadsheet. So I'll ask again, what did you do? Corbin stared at the city that had once felt like his empire. Now it seemed like a prison, and he suspected the walls were closing in faster than he'd realized. I threw away a diamond for worthless glass, he admitted finally, the words tasting like poison. William nodded grimly. Then God help you, son, because if Sophie's half as smart as I believe, you're about to discover exactly what you lost. But karma was preparing the shock of his lifetime. Because Sophie wasn't just coming back, she was coming back transformed. Chapter 3. The Vision Reborn. Sometimes a woman doesn't just transform, she evolves into something so breathtaking that grown men forget to breathe and whisper her name like discovering religion. The Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom had witnessed countless Manhattan elite celebrations, but none approached the sheer spectacle of Corbin Stubbs and Madison Davis's engagement party. Crystal chandeliers cast diamonds of light across marble floors, where New York's most powerful moved in carefully choreographed social ballet. Their conversations worth millions, their secrets priceless. Corbin positioned himself near the orchestra, nursing his third whiskey while watching Madison flutter between guests like a social butterfly seeking applause. She wore virginal white, premature perhaps, but symbolic of the fresh start they both claimed to desire. The $15,000 dress made her resemble every other society princess who'd ever graced these hallowed walls. "Spectacular party, old boy." Corbin turned to find Alexander Morgan approaching with the languid confidence of inherited wealth. At 38, Alexander commanded rooms through presence rather than volume, his old money elegance a sharp contrast to Corbin's nouveau riche flash. "Alexander, glad you could attend," Corbin replied, though his attention was split between his guest and Madison, who was currently monopolizing investors he desperately needed to court. "Wouldn't miss it, though I confess surprise at the timing." Alexander's smile carried diplomatic neutrality. 6 months seems rather hasty to move on from marriage, don't you think? Before Corbin could respond, a murmur rippled through the ballroom like wind across still water. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. The orchestra continued playing, but somehow the music seemed to fade beneath the weight of collective attention. She materialized in the doorway like a vision conjured from dreams that mere mortals weren't worthy to dream. The woman who had once been Sophie Stubbs had vanished, replaced by someone whose presence commanded the room with magnetic force. Sophie Queen, as she now called herself, wore midnight blue silk that seemed painted onto curves that spoke of dedication, discipline, and the kind of transformation requiring steel will. Her dark hair, once lifeless and neglected, now cascaded in glossy waves that caught light like spun obsidian. Her face showed the artistry of Manhattan's finest surgeons, not artificial enhancement, but revelation of the stunning woman who'd always existed beneath grief and neglect. Her posture radiated inner strength, and her eyes held power that could topple governments. "Sweet Jesus," Alexander Morgan breathed beside Corbin. "Who is that goddess?" Corbin couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't process that the ethereal creature commanding every gaze in the room had once stood before their bedroom mirror while he called her worthless. Sophie moved through the ballroom like liquid starlight. Effortless, inevitable, impossible to resist. Men turned to watch her pass with expressions ranging from reverence to religious awakening. Women studied her with mixtures of envy and grudging admiration. She acknowledged neither, moving with purpose toward the bar where she ordered something in a voice too soft to carry, but somehow impossible to ignore. "Corbin!" Madison appeared at his elbow, her voice tight with confusion and mounting alarm. "Who is that woman?" Everyone staring like she's royalty. Thomas Anderson, the billionaire pharmaceutical heir, reached Sophie first. At 42, he was handsome in the way extreme wealth made possible. Perfect teeth, perfect hair, perfect confidence. He offered her champagne and received a smile that could have powered Times Square. "She's absolutely stunning," gasped Victoria Whitney, the mayor's daughter, fanning herself dramatically. "I've never seen anyone carry themselves like that. It's like watching a queen." "More than royalty," murmured Patricia Lewis, whose husband controlled half the Upper East Side. "Royalty is inherited. That kind of presence is earned through fire." Whispers began spreading through the ballroom like ripples in a pond. "Who is she?" "I've never seen her before at society events." "Look at that gown. That's custom Versace, easily 50,000. "Did you see how Thomas Anderson approached her? He never approaches anyone first." "She's not wearing a wedding ring." "My God, she's absolutely magnificent." Corbin watched in growing horror as his engagement party transformed into Sophie's debut. Every conversation now revolved around speculation about the mysterious beauty who'd appeared like a force of nature. Madison's white dress suddenly seemed amateur, her carefully planned entrance forgotten, her moment stolen by a woman who wasn't even trying to compete. "Madison," Corbin said slowly, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. "Perhaps we should announce the engagement." But Madison wasn't listening. She was staring at Sophie with the expression of someone solving a puzzle she didn't want to complete. "Those cheekbones," Madison whispered. "Those eyes. Corbin, she looks familiar somehow." Benjamin Davis, Madison's cousin and a federal judge, approached their group with unusual excitement. "Have you seen the woman by the bar? I swear I recognize her from somewhere, but I can't place where." Sophie turned at that moment, her gaze sweeping across the ballroom with casual indifference until it found Corbin. For exactly 3 heartbeats, their eyes met across the crowded room. In those 3 heartbeats, Corbin felt the full weight of what he'd destroyed crash down on him like a collapsing skyscraper. Her expression didn't change. She didn't smile, didn't frown, didn't acknowledge him in any way an observer would notice. But in those 3 heartbeats, Corbin saw something in her eyes that made his knees weak, complete and total indifference. She turned back to Thomas Anderson, laughing at something he'd whispered with genuine delight, and Corbin realized that the woman who had once loved him desperately now felt absolutely nothing for him. "Oh my God!" Madison's voice emerged as a strangled whisper. "Oh my God, Corbin! That's her, isn't it? That's Sophie!" The words carried further than Madison intended. Conversation stopped, heads turned, the orchestra played on, but the ballroom had become a theater, and they were all witnessing the most dramatic performance of the social season. "Sophie!" Victoria Whitney's voice was loud enough to carry across half the room. "As in Sophie Stubbs? Corbin's ex-wife?" The whispers exploded into shocked murmurs. "That's Sophie Stubbs, the woman he left for Madison. But she's absolutely gorgeous. How could anyone leave someone who looks like that? What was he thinking? The man must have been blind." Judge Benjamin Davis laughed, a sound carrying clear disapproval. "Well, I'll be damned. Corbin, you magnificent fool. Do you comprehend what you've done?" At the bar, Sophie showed no sign of hearing the commotion. She was deep in conversation with Thomas Anderson, who seemed utterly captivated by whatever wisdom she was sharing. As Corbin watched, she placed her hand briefly on Thomas's arm, a casual gesture that somehow seemed more intimate than any kiss. Alexander Morgan shook his head in amazement. "I've witnessed some colossal mistakes in my time, old boy, but this might be the greatest blunder in Manhattan social history." "She's breathtaking," breathed Eleanor Hoffman, the governor's wife. "Absolutely radiant. How tragic. He left a diamond for fool's gold." Madison heard the comment and went deathly pale. "I need air," she whispered. And before Corbin could stop her, she was fleeing toward the terrace with tears streaming down her face. The engagement party continued, but the focus had irreversibly shifted. Sophie Queen had become the center of attention without effort, without design, simply by existing in a space where everyone could witness what Corbin Stubbs had been stupid enough to discard. As the evening progressed, a steady stream of Manhattan's most eligible bachelors found reasons to approach the bar. Sophie received their attention with gracious ease, making each feel clever and important while giving none more encouragement than polite conversation warranted. Corbin stood frozen in place, watching his former wife, transformed into someone he barely recognized, command the room that was supposed to celebrate his new beginning. The whiskey in his hand might as well have been poison. His mouth was dust, his palms were sweating, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt completely powerless. "You should approach her," Alexander suggested quietly. "Apologize, explain." "Explain what? That I was blind? That I was cruel? That I destroyed the best thing in my life because I was too arrogant to see her worth?" Corbin's voice was barely audible. "Yes, exactly that. But as Corbin watched Sophie laugh at something Thomas Anderson whispered in her ear, he realized that some mistakes were too catastrophic for apologies. Some bridges, once incinerated, could never be rebuilt. The irony was exquisite and devastating. The woman he'd once called ordinary had become the most extraordinary person in the room, and she was so far beyond his reach that he might as well have been invisible. He stood there drowning in regret while his engagement party continued around him, and Sophie Queen, the phoenix that had risen from the ashes of Sophie Stubbs, continued to shine like a star he'd been too blind to see when it was his to cherish. But regret was only the beginning of his punishment. Chapter 4. The Flowers in the Rain. There's something profoundly pathetic about watching a powerful man reduced to begging in a downpour, clutching wilted flowers like they could somehow resurrect the love he murdered with his own hands. 3 weeks had crawled by since the engagement party that became Sophie Queen's inadvertent coronation, and Corbin Stubbs hadn't experienced a single night of uninterrupted sleep. Every evening found him lying in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the image of his transformed ex-wife, commanding a room full of Manhattan's elite with effortless grace he'd never appreciated when it was his to claim. Madison had severed their engagement the morning after the party, her farewell delivered with surgical precision. "I refuse to be anyone's consolation prize," she'd declared, leaving behind only Chanel perfume and a $15,000 engagement ring that now sat in Corbin's desk drawer like an expensive monument to his failures. The business was hemorrhaging money faster than a severed artery. 3 additional major contracts had mysteriously evaporated, each loss accompanied by vague explanations about concerns regarding company stability and reassessment of partnership compatibility. William Anderson had abandoned pretending these were coincidences, his worried expression speaking volumes about influences being wielded against them from shadows they couldn't identify. But worse than the financial devastation, worse than the professional humiliation, was the obsession that had metastasized in Corbin's chest like cancer. Sophie Queen had become a fixture in Manhattan society pages, photographed at gallery openings with Thomas Anderson, at charity galas with Benjamin Morgan, at exclusive restaurants with a rotating cast of the city's most eligible bachelors. Each photo was a dagger to his pride, each headline a reminder of what he'd discarded. The rain had been falling for 6 relentless hours when Corbin finally reached his breaking point. He'd been sitting in his car outside Sophie's new penthouse building on the Upper East Side, a sleek glass tower that screamed old money sophistication, for 2 torturous hours, clutching a bouquet of white roses like a lifeline to sanity. The flowers were identical to those he'd given her on their first date 8 years ago, when she'd been a shy business student who'd blushed crimson when he'd kissed her goodnight on her dormitory steps. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now reduced to stalking the woman he'd once controlled completely. Sophie's building represented the kind of place where doormen wore tailored uniforms and residents' privacy was protected with religious devotion. Getting past the lobby would be impossible, but Corbin had discovered that Sophie sometimes used the private garden entrance when returning from evening events. The rain soaked through his Armani coat, plastering his hair to his skull and transforming the roses into a soggy mess of wilted petals. He looked like a madman, which he supposed was precisely what he was becoming. 6 months of searching for a woman who'd vanished, 3 weeks of realizing what he'd lost, and now this, standing in a deluge like some lovesick teenager hoping for a glimpse of his obsession. At 11:30 p.m., a black Mercedes glided through the building's private entrance. Corbin's heart hammered against his ribs as he recognized the elegant silhouette emerging from the passenger seat. Sophie Queen stepped into the rain wearing a stunning emerald evening gown and a wrap that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. She wasn't alone. Benjamin Morgan emerged from the driver's side, tall and distinguished in his tuxedo, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd never doubted his welcome anywhere. He opened an umbrella with practiced gallantry, shielding Sophie from the storm as they walked toward the building's entrance. Corbin stumbled forward from the shadows, the ruined bouquet clutched in his trembling hands. "Sophie, please, just listen once." Sophie stopped so abruptly that Benjamin nearly collided with her. She turned slowly, and even through the rain and darkness, Corbin could see the moment she recognized him. Her expression didn't change. No surprise, no anger, no fear. Just the kind of complete indifference that was somehow more devastating than hatred would have been. "Sophie, please," Corbin called out, his voice breaking as he approached through the downpour. "I know I don't deserve it, but just give me 5 minutes. Let me explain." "Sir, you need to leave immediately." Benjamin's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You're trespassing on private property." But Corbin only had eyes for Sophie. Up close, she was even more magnificent than she'd been at the party. The rain had turned her dark hair sleek and glossy, framing a face that belonged in Renaissance masterpieces. Her green eyes he'd once dismissed as plain, now seemed to hold depths he'd never bothered to explore. "These are for you," he said pathetically, extending the bedraggled roses. "Remember, our first date, you said they were the most beautiful flowers you'd ever seen." Sophie looked at the ruined bouquet for exactly 2 seconds. Then she adjusted her wrap and continued walking toward the building entrance, Benjamin's umbrella shielding only herself from the storm. "Sophie!" Corbin's voice cracked with anguish. "I'm sorry. I'm so fucking sorry. I know I was wrong. I know I hurt you, but please just talk to me." She didn't even pause. Benjamin Morgan stopped, however, turning back with an expression that could have frozen the Hudson River. "Listen carefully, Mr. Stubbs. Ms. Queen has made it crystal clear that she has no interest in speaking with you. If you continue this harassment, I'll be forced to involve the authorities." "Harassment? She's my wife." "Ex-wife," Benjamin corrected coldly. "And even if she weren't, standing in the rain stalking a woman who wants nothing to do with you is the behavior of a predator, not a husband." The words hit Corbin like individual punches. He watched helplessly as Benjamin escorted Sophie into the building, his protective gesture speaking of intimacy and care that Corbin had never shown the woman he'd claimed to love. The lobby doors closed with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the vacant courtyard. Corbin stood alone in the rain, holding wilted flowers and drowning in the silence that cut deeper than any screamed accusations could have. Sophie's silence was surgical in its precision. She hadn't called him names, hadn't told him he was pathetic, hadn't even acknowledged that he existed. She'd simply continued living her life as if he were no more significant than a stranger asking for directions. The rain intensified, turning the courtyard into a small lake. Corbin's shoes were ruined, his suit was destroyed, and the roses had disintegrated into a collection of brown petals that looked like the remnants of his marriage. He thought about their early days, when Sophie would illuminate whenever he entered a room. She'd been so eager to please him, so grateful for his attention, so desperately in love with the idea of being chosen by someone like him. He'd taken that devotion for granted, had seen it as weakness instead of recognizing it as the rare and precious gift it was. Now she looked through him like he was made of glass. A security guard appeared from the building, his expression professional but firm. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. This is private property." Corbin looked up at the building's towering facade, trying to guess which lights belonged to Sophie's apartment. Was she up there now, telling Benjamin about the pathetic man who'd ambushed her in the rain? Were they laughing about his ruined flowers, his obvious desperation? Or, and this was somehow worse, was she not thinking about him at all? "Sir," the security guard's voice was more insistent now. Corbin dropped the destroyed bouquet and walked back to his car, each step feeling like surrender. His hands shook as he started the engine, the dashboard lights illuminating a face that looked 10 years older than it had that morning. As he drove through the rain-soaked streets of Manhattan, past buildings he'd once felt destined to own, Corbin realized that Sophie's silence was the most eloquent condemnation he'd ever received. She didn't need to tell him he was pathetic. Her indifference spoke volumes about how thoroughly he'd destroyed any feelings she'd once harbored for him. He'd stood in the rain, begging for scraps of attention from a woman who'd once loved him unconditionally, and she'd given him exactly what he deserved, nothing. The irony was bitter and perfect. He'd spent 7 years taking Sophie's love for granted, dismissing her attempts to please him, ignoring her frantic desire for his approval. Now their roles were reversed, and he was the one begging for acknowledgement from someone who had learned to live without him. By the time he reached his empty penthouse, Corbin understood that this was only the beginning of his punishment. Sophie Queen wasn't going to scream at him or demand explanations or give him the dramatic confrontation his guilt craved. She was going to do something far more devastating. She was going to continue being magnificent while treating him like he'd never existed. That silence tortured him more than her anger ever could. Chapter 5. The Public Apology. Pride is a fortress that protects a man's ego from reality, but sometimes desperation becomes a battering ram that brings even the strongest walls crashing down in the most spectacular and mortifying way possible. The Columbia University Business School auditorium buzzed with anticipation as 200 MBA students settled into their seats for what promised to be one of the semester's most anticipated guest lectures. The topic was Strategic Corporate Transformation in the Digital Age, and the speaker was Sophie Queen, the enigmatic businesswoman who'd seemingly materialized from nowhere to become one of Manhattan's most sought-after consultants. Professor Michael Chen stood at the podium, adjusting his microphone as he prepared to introduce the woman whose reputation had preceded her into academic circles like wildfire. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to introduce someone who has revolutionized 3 Fortune 500 companies in the past 6 months, whose insights have been featured in Harvard Business Review, and whose transformation strategies have become the gold standard for corporate evolution. In the back row, concealed behind a pillar, Corbin Stubbs watched through bloodshot eyes as his ex-wife commanded the stage with the kind of presence he'd never recognized when she'd been his to claim. 2 weeks had crawled by since the rain-soaked disaster outside her building, 2 weeks of sleepless nights and bourbon-fueled attempts to understand how he'd become so obsessed with a woman he'd once dismissed as ordinary. Sophie stood at the lectern wearing a charcoal grey power suit that transformed her into something between a general and a goddess. Her hair was pulled back in a severe chignon that highlighted the elegant bone structure he'd been too blind to appreciate. When she spoke, her voice carried through the auditorium with the kind of authority that made even veteran executives lean forward to catch every word. Transformation, she began, is not about becoming someone new. It's about having the courage to become who you were always meant to be. The irony of her words hit Corbin like artillery fire. He'd spent the morning drinking coffee spiked with whiskey, rehearsing what he would say if he could just secure 5 minutes alone with her. The plan had been to wait until after her lecture, approach her privately, perhaps convince her to have dinner somewhere they could talk without interruption. But as he watched her captivate an auditorium full of brilliant minds, as he saw students hanging on her every word with the kind of reverence he'd never shown her insights, something inside him snapped. The liquor, the desperation, the weeks of sleepless obsession, all of it converged into a moment of spectacular poor judgment that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The key to successful transformation, Sophie continued, is understanding that change requires both vision and sacrifice. You must be willing to let go of who you were to become. Sophie. The name exploded through the auditorium like a gunshot. 200 heads turned in unison as Corbin stumbled from behind the pillar, his suit wrinkled from too many sleepless nights, his hair disheveled, his eyes wild with the desperation of a man who'd lost everything that mattered. "Sophie, please, I was blind, I was cruel, and I was wrong. Forgive me." The auditorium erupted in shocked whispers. Phones materialized like magic, their cameras capturing every second of what was rapidly becoming the most spectacular public meltdown in Colombia's recent history. Students exchanged glances that ranged from fascination to second-hand embarrassment as they witnessed a millionaire businessman reduced to begging in their lecture hall. Sophie's reaction was devastatingly perfect. She didn't gasp, didn't step back, didn't show even a flicker of surprise or embarrassment. Instead, she paused for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for the auditorium to fall into complete silence, and then smiled with the kind of professional courtesy she might show a confused delivery driver who'd wandered into the wrong building. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly through the stunned silence, "you are disturbing the class." The words were delivered with such polite dismissal that they hit harder than any screamed insult could have. She hadn't called him by name, hadn't acknowledged their history, hadn't given him even the dignity of recognition. To her, he was simply Sir, a random interruption to be handled with professional grace. Nervous laughter rippled through the auditorium, starting with a few snickers and building into waves of barely contained amusement. Students looked at each other with expressions that mixed shock, entertainment, and profound second-hand embarrassment for the man who'd just humiliated himself in front of Colombia's future business leaders. "Professor Chen," Sophie continued smoothly, "perhaps security could help this gentleman find his way to the appropriate venue for his concerns." Professor Chen, clearly mortified by the disruption to his prestigious guest lecture, frantically gestured toward the campus security guards who were already moving down the aisles. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately. This is a private academic event." But Corbin was beyond caring about dignity or consequences. The alcohol, the desperation, and the sight of Sophie treating him like a stranger combined to strip away the last of his self-control. "You don't understand," he called out, his voice cracking with emotion. "I love her. I've loved her for 8 years. Sophie, I know I hurt you. I know I was terrible, but please just give me one chance to explain." The phones captured every word, every gesture, every moment of his spectacular downfall. Colombia Breakdown started trending within minutes, accompanied by videos of a disheveled millionaire begging his ex-wife for forgiveness while she stood at a podium looking like the CEO of his nightmares. "Security!" Professor Chen's voice was sharp with authority. "Remove this man immediately." 2 guards approached Corbin from either side, their expressions professionally neutral, but their body language suggesting they'd had experience with intoxicated alumni making scenes at academic events. The students watched with rapt attention as the drama unfolded, some looking sympathetic, others clearly enjoying the spectacle of watching privilege and power reduced to pathetic desperation. "Sophie, please!" Corbin's voice was raw with anguish as the guards took his arms. "I lost you once because I was stupid. Don't make me lose you again because I was too proud to beg." For just a moment, barely a heartbeat, something flickered across Sophie's face. Not forgiveness, not love, but perhaps the faintest shadow of pity for the man who'd once shared her bed and was now making a public spectacle of himself in front of strangers. Then the moment passed, and her expression returned to professional neutrality. "As I was saying before the interruption," she continued, her voice steady and clear, "transformation requires the courage to let go of past mistakes and focus on future possibilities. Moving forward often means accepting that some chapters of our lives have ended permanently." The message was unmistakable, and the students understood it perfectly. Several of them actually applauded, not for Corbin's removal, but for Sophie's masterful handling of what could have been a mortifying situation. As the security guards escorted him from the auditorium, Corbin heard the laughter following him like a soundtrack to his degradation. Not cruel laughter, but the kind of nervous amusement that erupted when people witnessed something so awkward they didn't know how else to react. The doors closed behind him with a finality that echoed through the hallway. Through the windows, he could see Sophie continuing her lecture as if nothing had happened, commanding the room with the same effortless authority she'd displayed before his interruption. Within hours, the videos would be everywhere. Millionaire meltdown would trend on Twitter. Business blogs would pick up the story, turning his public degradation into case studies about the dangers of mixing personal drama with professional settings. His mother would call, his business partners would express concern, and his reputation would take another devastating hit. But as Corbin stumbled across Columbia's campus in the afternoon sunlight, none of that mattered as much as the realization that Sophie had handled his desperate proclamation of love with the same cool professionalism she might show a difficult client. She hadn't been angry or hurt, or even particularly surprised. She'd simply managed the situation. He'd poured out his heart in front of 200 witnesses, had sacrificed the last of his dignity on the altar of his obsession, and she'd treated it like a minor scheduling inconvenience. The message was clear. Sophie Queen had evolved beyond the reach of Corbin Stubbs's regrets, and all the public apologies in the world wouldn't change the fact that she'd learned to live without him. His phone buzzed with notifications. Twitter mentions, news alerts, text messages from colleagues who'd already seen the videos. The shame was going viral in real time, ensuring that his spectacular failure would be preserved forever in the digital amber of social media. As he reached his car, Corbin realized that this was what rock bottom looked like, standing in a parking lot while the entire internet watched him beg for forgiveness from a woman who'd responded by calling him sir. Yet even humiliation couldn't kill his hope. Chapter 6. The ring returned. Some gestures are meant to heal old wounds, but when they're performed by the wrong person at the wrong time, they become monuments to delusion and the desperate refusal to accept that some stories have already ended. The Tiffany and Company box sat on Corbin's desk like a small blue accusation, its presence haunting him for 3 days since he'd retrieved it from the vault where he'd stored it after Madison's departure. Inside lay the 3-carat diamond engagement ring he'd given Sophie 7 years ago, back when he'd been 28, and arrogant enough to believe that love was something you could purchase with the right setting and sufficient carats. October 15th. Sophie's 31st birthday. He remembered because she'd reminded him every year for 7 years, had circled the date on their shared calendar, had planned intimate dinners that he'd often postponed for business meetings that seemed more important at the time. How many of her birthdays had he ruined with his indifference? How many celebrations had he treated as inconveniences rather than opportunities to show her she mattered? The viral degradation at Columbia had been 3 weeks ago, and the internet had finally moved on to fresher scandals. But Corbin's obsession had only deepened, fed by the complete absence of reaction from Sophie. No angry phone calls, no restraining orders, no acknowledgement that his public breakdown had even occurred. She'd simply continued existing in her new life while he spiraled deeper into his private hell. The plan, if his alcohol-fueled reasoning could be called a plan, was beautiful in its simplicity. He would surprise her at her office building with the ring, would recreate the proposal that had once made her cry with joy, would offer her the symbol of a commitment he'd failed to honor the first time but was ready to worship now. Meridian Tower rose 47 floors above the financial district, its glass facade reflecting the October sun like a monument to American ambition. Sophie Queen Consulting occupied the entire 32nd floor, a fact that had required considerable detective work and more than a few bribes to building security personnel who were unimpressed by his name and credentials. Corbin stood in the marble lobby at 11:47 a.m., the Tiffany box burning in his jacket pocket like a talisman of hope and desperation. He'd been there since 10, nursing coffee in the building's cafe while building up the courage for what felt like the most important conversation of his life. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor lasted an eternity. His reflection in the polished steel doors showed a man who'd aged 5 years in 5 months. Hollow cheeks, haunted eyes, the kind of desperation that no amount of tailored clothing could disguise. Sophie Queen Consulting's reception area was a masterpiece of understated elegance. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of Manhattan Harbor, while modern art and fresh orchids created an atmosphere of sophisticated success. The receptionist, a poised woman in her 40s, looked up with the kind of trained smile that suggested she was accustomed to dealing with walk-in clients who believed their problems were urgent enough to warrant immediate attention. "Good morning. How may I help you?" "I need to see Sophie Queen. It's personal." The receptionist's smile became marginally cooler. "I'm sorry, but Ms. Queen only sees clients by appointment. If you'd like to schedule a consultation, I can check her availability for next month." "Next month?" Corbin's voice cracked with disbelief. "No, you don't understand. I'm Corbin Stubbs. I was her husband." Recognition flickered across the receptionist's features, quickly replaced by the kind of neutral efficiency that suggested she'd been briefed on exactly this scenario. "I see. Mr. Stubbs, I'm afraid Ms. Queen is in meetings all day. However, I'd be happy to take a message." "A message?" The words came out louder than he'd intended, drawing glances from other visitors in the reception area. "I need to see her. Today. It's her birthday. Sir, I understand this may be important to you, but 5 minutes. That's all I need. 5 minutes to explain, to apologize, to—" He pulled the Tiffany box from his pocket, holding it like evidence in his own defense. "To give her this." The receptionist's expression shifted from courtesy to something approaching pity. "Mr. Stubbs, please understand that Ms. Queen has been very clear about her preferences regarding personal visits. I cannot interrupt her schedule for unannounced appointments." Through the glass walls of the reception area, Corbin could see figures moving in the conference rooms beyond. Was Sophie in one of those rooms? Was she close enough to reach if he could just get past this guardian at the gates? "Please," he said, the words scraping his throat raw. "It's her birthday. I know I don't deserve her time, but just give her the ring. Tell her I remember now. Tell her I remember everything." The elevator dinged behind him, and Corbin's heart stopped as he recognized the voice that emerged from it. "Jennifer, has the Morrison contract been finalized? I want to review the liability clauses before—" Sophie Queen stepped into the reception area, wearing a navy blue dress that transformed her into something between a CEO and a work of art. Her hair was shorter than it had been at Columbia, cut in a sharp bob that framed her face with geometric precision. She carried herself with the kind of confidence that spoke of someone who'd learned to navigate rooms full of men who underestimated her and had taught them all to regret that mistake. She saw him immediately, of course. There was no moment of surprise, no shock of recognition, no pause in her perfectly controlled composure. She simply acknowledged his presence the way she might notice a piece of furniture that had been rearranged while she was out. "Mr. Stubbs." Her voice was coolly neutral, the same tone she might use to address a vendor who'd shown up with the wrong delivery. "This is unexpected. Sophie." Her name came out as a prayer, a plea, a frantic attempt to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. "I know I don't have an appointment, but it's your birthday and I needed to give you this." He held out the Tiffany box with trembling hands. the small blue cube representing every regret, every sleepless night, every moment of frantic realization that he'd thrown away something irreplaceable. Sophie looked at the box for exactly 3 seconds. When she raised her eyes to meet his, Corbin saw nothing. No anger, no hurt, no curiosity about what might be inside. Just the kind of polite indifference she might show a stranger offering directions to somewhere she didn't want to go. "Let me start again," he continued, his voice breaking as he dropped to one knee in the reception area of her company, surrounded by clients and employees who were now witnessing the second public degradation of his life. "Sophie, I was blind. I was cruel. I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too stupid to see what I had." The ring box opened with a soft click, revealing the diamond that had once symbolized their future. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the office building, it looked smaller than he remembered, less impressive, like a prop from a play he could no longer remember the lines to. "This ring," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I gave it to you when I thought love was something you could buy. When I thought marriage was a business transaction. I know better now. I know what I lost. Please, Sophie, let me start again." Sophie looked down at him with an expression that might have been pity or might have been simple observation of a pathetic spectacle. When she finally spoke, her words fell like stones into still water. "That ring carries your betrayal, not your love." The words were spoken softly, without venom or anger, but they hit Corbin with the force of physical blows. She wasn't screaming at him, or demanding explanations, or giving him the dramatic reaction his guilt craved. She was simply stating a fact as immutable as gravity. "Sophie, please, I have a meeting in 5 minutes, Mr. Stubbs. I suggest you take your ring and leave." She turned toward her office without another word, her heels clicking against the marble floor with the steady rhythm of someone who had more important places to be. At her office door, she paused and spoke to her receptionist without looking back. "Jennifer, please call security if Mr. Stubbs isn't gone in 2 minutes, and in the future, Mr. Stubbs is not to be admitted to this floor under any circumstances." The door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo through the sudden silence of the reception area. Corbin knelt there on the marble floor, holding an engagement ring that no longer had any meaning, surrounded by strangers who'd witnessed his second spectacular failure in 3 weeks. The receptionist looked at him with professional sympathy, the kind reserved for people who were clearly having mental health episodes in public spaces. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." He closed the ring box with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else and struggled to his feet. His knees hurt from kneeling on marble, but that pain was nothing compared to the ache in his chest as he realized that Sophie Queen had just delivered the most devastating rejection of his life without raising her voice or showing the slightest hint of emotion. She hadn't taken the ring, hadn't thrown it back at him, hadn't given him the dramatic confrontation that might have felt like progress, like engagement, like proof that she still cared enough to be angry. Instead, she'd simply stated that the symbol of their former love now represented only his failures, and she'd walked away from both the ring and the man offering it with the same casual indifference she might show yesterday's newspaper. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, Corbin understood that he'd just been erased. Not destroyed, not defeated, but simply made irrelevant to the life of the woman who'd once loved him more than her own happiness. The ring box felt heavier in his pocket than it had going up, weighted down with the knowledge that some gestures were too little, too late, and that some wounds once inflicted could never be healed by the very hands that had caused them. Every rejection only made him burn with more desperation. Chapter 7. The Family Intervention. When a man has lost everything else, he often turns to the one place he believes love should be unconditional, only to discover that some betrayals are so complete they poison even the deepest wells of family loyalty. The Long Island estate where Sophie had grown up stretched across 3 manicured acres of autumn perfection, its colonial architecture speaking of traditional values and the kind of middle-class prosperity that had built America's suburbs. Oak trees shed golden leaves across the circular driveway, where Corbyn's BMW looked conspicuously out of place among the practical sedans and SUVs that belonged to people who worked for their money rather than inheriting it. He sat in his car for 20 agonizing minutes, gathering courage to approach the front door of a house he'd visited dozens of times during his courtship of Sophie but hadn't seen since their wedding 7 years ago. Back then, he'd been the golden boy, Columbia graduate, rising real estate star, the handsome prince who'd rescued their daughter from a life of financial uncertainty. Robert and Helen Smith had welcomed him like the son they'd never had, proud that their brilliant daughter had captured the heart of someone so obviously destined for success. Now he was the villain in their family's story, and he was about to grovel for their intercession like a child begging parents to fix a mess too catastrophic for him to handle alone. The October air carried the scent of burning leaves and approaching winter as Corbyn finally forced himself from the car and walked the brick path to the front door. His hands shook as he pressed the doorbell, the simple chime triggering memories of Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings when he'd been part of this family's inner circle. Robert Smith opened the door with the expression of a man who'd been expecting this visit and dreading it in equal measure. At 62, Sophie's father still carried himself with the dignity of someone who'd built a successful construction company through honest work and ethical dealings. His grey hair was neatly combed, his weekend clothes pressed and clean, but his eyes held the kind of disappointment that no amount of politeness could disguise. Corbyn. The greeting was neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile, but lacking any warmth that might suggest forgiveness was possible. "Mr. Smith, I know I don't have any right to be here, but I need to talk to you and Helen about Sophie, about what I've done." Corbyn's voice cracked on his ex-wife's name, the syllables carrying more weight than he could bear. Robert studied him for a long moment, taking in the hollow cheeks, the haunted eyes, the expensive suit that couldn't disguise the desperation bleeding through his carefully maintained facade. Finally, he stepped aside. "Come in. Helen's in the kitchen." The Smith family home hadn't changed in 7 years. The same photographs lined the hallway, Sophie's graduation pictures, family vacations, wedding photos that now seemed like evidence from a crime scene. Corbyn's image appeared in several frames, but someone had clearly been through them recently, removing the pictures that featured him too prominently. What remained were careful crops that included him only as necessary background to preserve Sophie's memories. Helen Smith stood at the kitchen sink, her back rigid with the kind of tension that suggested she'd been preparing for this confrontation. At 59, she retained the graceful beauty that Sophie had inherited, though months of worry had added lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights spent wondering how her daughter was healing from wounds too deep to discuss over Sunday phone calls. "Helen," Corbyn said softly. She turned slowly, and the expression on her face nearly brought him to his knees. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was something far more devastating. It was the look of a mother who'd watched her child suffer and knew exactly who was responsible for that suffering. "Corbyn." Her voice carried the weight of every tear Sophie had shed, every phone call where her daughter had tried to hide her pain. Every sleepless night, Helen had spent imagining the cruelty that had driven her child to disappear for 6 months without contact. "You look terrible." The observation was delivered without satisfaction or sympathy, just stated as fact. Corbyn did look terrible. He'd lost 25 pounds, had aged 5 years in 5 months, and currently resembled a scarecrow dressed in designer clothing. "I deserve that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I deserve far worse." "Yes," Helen said simply, "you do." Robert gestured toward the kitchen table where they'd shared so many family meals in happier times. "Sit down, son. Say what you came to say." The endearment, "son," hit Corbyn like a physical blow. Even now, even after everything, Robert Smith's fundamental decency wouldn't allow him to withdraw the familial affection that had once felt like birthright. Corbin collapsed into the chair across from Sophie's parents, his composure finally cracking completely. The words came out in a broken rush of confession and desperation. I lost her. I lost the best woman in my life because I was too proud, too stupid, too blind to see what I had. Helen, I said things to her that I can't take back. I hurt her in ways that... He stopped, choking on admissions that felt like swallowing glass. I destroyed her, and now she won't even look at me. She treats me like I'm nobody, like I never existed, and I don't know how to live with what I've done. Helen's expression didn't soften. If anything, it became more granite-like as she absorbed the confirmation of what she'd suspected for months. Tell me exactly what you said to my daughter, Corbin. Tell me what you did that made her disappear for 6 months without telling her own mother where she was going. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock that had marked time through Sophie's childhood. Corbin looked into the faces of the people who'd welcomed him as family and saw them waiting for him to confess sins they already knew he'd committed. I called her ugly, he whispered. I told her no man would ever desire her. I said I only married her for convenience. I had an affair. And when she found out, I told my mistress that I couldn't wait to divorce the fat cow so we could honeymoon in Paris. Helen's intake of breath was sharp enough to cut glass. Robert's hands clenched into fists that spoke of violence barely contained by decades of civilized behavior. You called my daughter ugly? Helen's voice was deadly quiet. My Sophie. My beautiful, brilliant, loving daughter who worshipped the ground you walked on. I was wrong. I was so fucking wrong. Helen, she's not ugly. She's magnificent. She's become this incredible woman, this force of nature, and I threw her away like garbage because I was too blind to see. Stop! Robert's voice carried the authority of a man who'd spent 40 years managing construction crews and brooked no arguments when safety was at stake. Just stop talking, Corbin. You don't get to sit in my kitchen and praise my daughter's beauty now that she's learned to live without you. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I don't deserve another chance. But maybe if you talked to her, if you told her how sorry I am. No. The single word came from the kitchen doorway. All three of them turned to see Sophie standing there, her hand still on the door handle, her face a mask of composure that couldn't quite hide the pain underneath. She was more beautiful than she'd ever been, wearing jeans and a cashmere sweater that somehow looked more elegant than any evening gown. Her hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, and her skin glowed with the kind of health that came from finally learning to take care of herself instead of trying to please someone who'd never appreciated her efforts. Sophie. Honey. Helen rose from her chair, moving toward her daughter with the protective instincts of a mother bear. I didn't know you were coming. I called an hour ago, but you were in the garden. I let myself in. Sophie's eyes never left Corbin's face, but there was no recognition there, no acknowledgement of shared history or buried feelings. Just the cool assessment of someone observing a mildly interesting specimen. I heard voices and wanted to make sure you were okay. I was just leaving, Corbin said, starting to rise from his chair. No. Sophie's voice was calm, authoritative, the tone of someone accustomed to having her orders followed. Stay. I want to hear this. She moved to stand beside her mother, one hand resting protectively on Helen's shoulder. The gesture was small, but spoke volumes about how the family dynamics had shifted. Sophie was no longer the child seeking approval, but the successful adult protecting parents who'd sacrificed for her happiness. Corbin was telling us how sorry he is, Robert said carefully, his eyes moving between his daughter and the man who'd broken her heart. How he wants us to intercede on his behalf. Sophie's smile was polite, distant, the expression she might wear while declining an invitation to an event she had no interest in attending. "I see. And what did you tell him?" Helen's hand covered her daughter's, the simple touch speaking of solidarity and shared strength. "We told him that some mistakes are too big for apologies, that some people don't deserve second chances. Especially," Robert added, his voice heavy with disappointment, "when they only realize what they've lost after someone else shows them what they threw away." Sophie nodded, as if this was exactly what she'd expected to hear. She looked at Corbin with the kind of detached interest an entomologist might show when studying a particularly pathetic insect. "Do you know what the worst part was, Corbin? It wasn't the affair. It wasn't even the cruel words. It was the realization that you never saw me at all. For 7 years, you lived with a woman you didn't know, didn't understand, didn't value. You married an idea of me that existed only in your head, the grateful little girl who'd be eternally thankful for your attention." Her words were delivered without anger or venom, just stated as fact, with the kind of clinical precision that made them cut deeper than screamed accusations could have. "Sophie, please, I forgive you," she said, and for a moment Corbin's heart leaped with desperate hope. "I forgive you for being exactly who you were, but forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It just means I'm not going to carry your poison anymore." She kissed her mother's cheek, squeezed her father's shoulder, and headed back toward the door. At the threshold, she paused without turning around. "Mom, Dad, he doesn't deserve another chance. Don't let him manipulate your kindness into thinking otherwise." The door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo through the sudden silence of the kitchen. Helen turned to face Corbin with tears in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sympathy for his pain. They were tears of pride for a daughter who'd learned to value herself enough to walk away from people who'd failed to cherish her properly. "You heard her," Helen said quietly. "She's forgiven you, which is more grace than you deserve. But she's also done with you, and so are we." Robert stood up, his meaning unmistakable. "I think it's time for you to leave, Corbin. And I think it's time for you to stop bothering our daughter." As Corbin walked back to his car, he could see Sophie through the kitchen window, hugging her parents with the kind of easy affection that spoke of relationships built on mutual respect and unconditional love. She looked peaceful, settled, like someone who'd finally found her way home after a long journey through dark territory. He'd come here hoping to recruit allies in his campaign to win her back. But instead, he'd witnessed something that cut deeper than any rejection. Sophie Queen was genuinely happy without him. The family he'd once been part of had closed ranks around their daughter, protecting her from the man who'd caused her pain. And Sophie herself had delivered the most devastating blow of all. Not anger, not hatred, but complete indifference wrapped in forgiveness that felt like a funeral blessing. It seemed his last chance was slipping away. Chapter 8. The Breaking Point. There comes a moment in every man's descent when the bottom reveals itself to be not a destination, but a trapdoor leading to depths he never imagined possible. And sometimes the only way out is to fall so far that dignity becomes a luxury he can no longer afford. November in Manhattan carried the bite of approaching winter, and Corbin Stubbs felt every degree of it in his bones as he sat in his empty penthouse, staring at the wall of windows that had once made him feel like he ruled the city spread out below. Now those same windows felt like the barriers of an aquarium, separating him from a world that continued spinning without his participation or permission. The business was dying a slow, agonizing death. 3 more contracts had evaporated in the past week, each cancellation accompanied by the same vague explanations about strategic realignment and concerns about company stability that had become the soundtrack to his professional destruction. William Anderson had finally said what they'd both been thinking. Someone with serious influence was systematically dismantling Stubbs' development, and they both knew who possessed both the motivation and the resources to orchestrate such precise devastation. The irony was exquisite and torturous. Sophie had been his secret weapon during their marriage, the brilliant analyst who'd reviewed every major deal, who'd caught flaws in contracts that could have cost millions, who'd built the financial models that had made Stubbs' development a powerhouse. He'd taken credit for her insights, had presented her work as his own inspiration, had treated her contributions like background noise rather than the foundation of his success. Now she was using those same skills to tear down everything they'd built together, one calculated move at a time. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Lunch cancelled. I need space to think about the man you've become." Even Eleanor Stubbs, who'd defended him through every childhood transgression and professional controversy, had finally reached the limit of her maternal loyalty. The bottle of Macallan 25 sat on his coffee table, nearly empty, despite having been full when he'd opened it at noon. Alcohol had become his most reliable companion, the only thing that could quiet the voice in his head that replayed Sophie's words on an endless loop. "That ring carries your betrayal, not your love." The penthouse felt like a mausoleum, every room haunted by memories of the woman who'd once shared this space, who'd filled it with laughter and warmth and the kind of domestic happiness he'd been too arrogant to appreciate. The kitchen where she'd made Sunday morning pancakes, the library where she'd read while he'd worked late, the bedroom where she'd waited for him to come home, to choose her over whatever deal or client or mistress had captured his attention that day. Now it was just expensive furniture, arranged in rooms that echoed with his own breathing and the distant hum of a city that had moved on without him. His laptop sat open to a Google search that had become his nightly obsession. Sophie Queen, New York. The results were a parade of professional triumphs and social appearances that documented her transformation from abandoned wife to Manhattan's most sought-after business consultant. Every photo showed her more radiant than the last, usually accompanied by some eligible bachelor who looked at her with the kind of reverence Corbin had never shown when she'd been his to cherish. Tonight's particular torture was a society blog post about a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The headline read, "Mystery Maven Sophie Queen Dazzles at Annual Arts Preservation Benefit," accompanied by a photo that stopped his breath completely. She wore a black evening gown that transformed her into something between a goddess and a work of art, her hair swept up to reveal the elegant neck he'd once kissed, her smile radiant as she posed with Thomas Anderson, the pharmaceutical heir who seemed to be her most frequent companion these days. They looked perfect together. Beautiful, successful, the kind of power couple that graced magazine covers and made other people dream of lives they'd never achieve. The article mentioned that Sophie had made a generous contribution to the museum's restoration fund, and Corbin found himself wondering how much money she'd donated. Where had she gotten the resources for philanthropy on this scale? The trust fund from her grandmother was substantial but not limitless, certainly not enough to support a Manhattan penthouse, a consulting business, and charitable giving that impressed society reporters. Unless, the realization hit him like artillery fire. He opened his laptop and began searching through financial records, business filings, anything that might confirm the suspicion growing in his chest like a malignant tumor. It took 3 hours and 2 more glasses of Macallan, but he found it. Sophie Queen Consulting had acquired a silent partner in August, just 2 months after Sophie's disappearance. The investor was listed as SQ Holdings, a shell company that, after considerable detective work, traced back to the offshore accounts that held Sophie's inheritance from her grandmother. But that wasn't the devastating part. The devastating part was the amount of the investment, $47 million. The exact amount her grandmother had left in trust, the money that had been sitting in conservative investments for 6 years while Sophie had lived modestly off the interest, never touching the principal. The money she'd never mentioned during their marriage had never used to buy designer clothes or expensive jewelry or any of the luxuries that Madison Davis considered necessities. Sophie had possessed the resources to live independently all along. She could have left him years ago, could have built her own empire without his name or his connections or his money. Instead, she'd stayed, had tried to build a life with him, had chosen love over financial independence until he'd made that choice impossible. The laptop screen blurred as the implications sank in. Sophie hadn't disappeared because she was heartbroken or desperate or financially dependent. She'd vanished because she'd finally decided he wasn't worth the effort of trying to fix what he'd broken. And now she was using that same money, the fortune she'd hidden throughout their marriage, to systematically destroy everything he'd built. Every cancelled contract, every withdrawn investment, every mysterious business reversal could be traced to the influence of someone with unlimited resources and intimate knowledge of his weaknesses. His phone rang, the sound sharp in the silence of the empty penthouse. The caller ID showed William Anderson, probably calling with more catastrophic news about another contract that had mysteriously evaporated. "We need to talk." William's voice was grim. "Emergency meeting. My office. Now." "It's midnight, William." "I don't care if it's fucking Christmas. Get down here. I just got off the phone with Morrison Industries. They're not just cancelling their contract, they're considering a lawsuit over the preliminary work we've already completed." Corbin closed his eyes, feeling the weight of inevitable defeat settling over him like a burial shroud. "They can't sue us. The work met all specifications. They're claiming the structural analysis was flawed, that the foundation recommendations wouldn't support the building design, that we either misrepresented our capabilities or deliberately provided substandard work." The words hit Corbin like individual punches. The structural analysis had been Sophie's work. Brilliant, thorough, absolutely flawless. She'd spent weeks on those calculations, had triple-checked every specification, had caught potential problems that other firms would have missed entirely. "That's impossible. The analysis was perfect. I know it was perfect. You know it was perfect. But somehow, Morrison Industries has an independent report that contradicts our findings, signed by experts who are claiming our work was either incompetent or fraudulent." Corbin sank deeper into his chair, understanding flooding through him with sickening clarity. Sophie wasn't just destroying his business, she was destroying his reputation, ensuring that even if he survived the financial devastation, no one would ever trust Stubbs' development again. "There's more," William continued. "The SEC wants to meet with us next week. Something about irregularities in our project financing and questions about whether we've been misrepresenting our qualifications to investors." "What irregularities?" "I don't know yet. But Corbin..." William's voice carried the weight of a friendship that was about to end. "I think you need to tell me everything. About Sophie, about what really happened. Because whatever you did to that woman, she's about to bury us so deep, we'll never see daylight again." The call ended, leaving Corbin alone with the wreckage of his life and the growing understanding that Sophie Queen wasn't just moving on from their marriage. She was making sure he could never hurt anyone the way he'd hurt her. He poured the last of the Macallan and walked to the windows overlooking the city that had once felt like his kingdom. Somewhere out there, Sophie was probably asleep in her own penthouse, surrounded by the trappings of success she'd built without his help or his permission. She was winning, and she was doing it with resources and intelligence she'd possessed all along, but had never used against him until she'd made her disappearance the only viable option. The most devastating part wasn't that she'd hidden her wealth throughout their marriage. It was that she'd chosen to be financially dependent on him, had voluntarily given up her autonomy because she'd believed their love was worth more than her freedom. And he'd repaid that trust by calling her ugly and cheating on her with a woman who saw him as nothing more than a bank account with good bone structure. As Manhattan glittered below him like a circuit board of broken dreams, Corbin realized that he'd finally found rock bottom. It wasn't the business failures, or the social humiliation, or even the complete destruction of his reputation. It was the understanding that Sophie Queen had loved him enough to make herself vulnerable, and he'd been too stupid to recognize that vulnerability as the gift it was. Now she was showing him exactly what he'd thrown away, one calculated move at a time. The whiskey burned his throat as he finished the bottle, but it couldn't touch the cold that had settled in his chest. Tomorrow, William would resign from their partnership. His mother would continue avoiding his calls, the SEC would begin their investigation, and Sophie would continue building her empire while his crumbled to dust. He'd thought rock bottom was standing in the rain begging for her attention. He'd thought it was being called Sir in a Columbia lecture hall. He'd thought it was kneeling on marble floors while she walked away from engagement rings and broken promises. But he'd been wrong. Rock bottom was this: sitting alone in his empty penthouse, finally understanding that Sophie Queen had loved him with a fortune at her disposal and had chosen to depend on him instead. And he'd thrown away that trust for a woman who would have left him the moment his bank account ran dry. His obsession was about to explode in the most shocking way. Chapter 9. The Discovery. Obsession is a strange alchemy that transforms love into something toxic, and when that poison reaches critical mass, it drives even rational men to acts of desperate stupidity that would horrify their former selves. The private investigator's office smelled like stale coffee and broken dreams, its filing cabinets stuffed with the secrets of Manhattan's elite and the evidence of their various indiscretions. Marcus Webb had been tracking unfaithful spouses and corporate espionage for 23 years, but he'd never seen a client quite as deteriorated as Corbin Stubbs, who sat across from his desk looking like a scarecrow dressed in what had once been a $5,000 suit. "You want me to follow your ex-wife?" Webb said, his voice carefully neutral as he reviewed the retainer check that would keep his office running for another month. "Mr. Stubbs, I have to ask, have you considered therapy? Or maybe a vacation somewhere far from Manhattan?" Corbin's laugh was bitter, sharp enough to cut glass. "I've considered a lot of things: therapy, vacation, drinking myself to death. But what I need is information. I need to know where she goes, who she sees, what makes her happy now. I need to understand who Sophie Queen really is." Webb studied his client with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen obsession in all its forms. Corbin had lost at least 25 pounds, his expensive clothes hanging off his frame like borrowed costumes. His hair was unkempt, his eyes were bloodshot, and his hands shook with the slight tremor of someone who'd been using alcohol as medication for too long. "What exactly are you hoping to accomplish with this surveillance?" "I need to find her weakness. Some way to reach her, to make her listen, to prove that I've changed." Corbin's voice cracked on the words. "She treats me like I'm invisible, like I never existed, but she has to have some vulnerability, some way I can show her that what we had was real." Webb had been in this business long enough to recognize the difference between heartbreak and dangerous obsession. This felt dangerously close to the latter. "Mr. Stubbs, I'm going to be direct with you. Following your ex-wife around Manhattan isn't going to win her back. It's going to get you arrested for stalking. I'm not asking you to stalk her. I'm asking you to provide me with information, her schedule, her habits, the places she frequents. I need to understand her life now." Against his better judgment, Webb accepted the case. The retainer was substantial. His bills were mounting, and Corbin Stubbs didn't seem like the type to escalate to violence. He just seemed like a man drowning in regret who was grasping for any lifeline that might lead back to the woman he'd lost. The surveillance began immediately, and within 3 days, Webb had compiled a comprehensive profile of Sophie Queen's new life. What he discovered was a woman who'd constructed a routine that was both impressive and heartbreaking in its solitary perfection. Sophie's days began at 5:30 a.m. with a workout at an exclusive Upper East Side gym, where she trained with a personal trainer who looked like he'd been carved from marble. She walked to work regardless of weather, always taking the same route through Central Park that allowed her to feed the ducks at the reservoir. Her office building housed the most successful consulting firm in Manhattan, where she worked 12-hour days with a dedication that suggested someone using professional achievement to fill emotional voids. But it was her evening routine that provided the information Corbin was really seeking. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Sophie Queen took herself to tea at the Blue Box Cafe inside Tiffany & Company, where she sat alone at a corner table, reading business journals while sipping Earl Grey and picking at delicate pastries she never quite finished. It was a ritual that spoke of someone who'd learned to enjoy her own company, but hadn't quite figured out how to fill all the empty hours that solitude provided. Webb's photographs captured her in unguarded moments, stirring her tea while lost in thought, gazing out the windows at Fifth Avenue with an expression that might have been contentment or might have been carefully constructed composure. She was always elegantly dressed, always perfectly presented, but there was something in her posture that suggested she was still learning how to be alone without feeling lonely. She goes to tea by herself. Corbin studied the photographs like they were archaeological artifacts that might reveal the secrets of a lost civilization. Every Tuesday and Thursday, like clockwork, Webb confirmed, always orders the same thing, always sits at the same table, always alone. Occasionally, someone approaches her, usually men who recognize her from society events, but she's polite and dismissive. Never gives anyone more than 5 minutes of conversation. Corbin's hands trembled as he traced Sophie's image in the photographs. She looked peaceful in them, settled in a way she'd never appeared during their marriage. Even when she'd been trying her hardest to please him, there had always been an underlying tension in her posture, a frantic energy that came from constantly trying to earn love from someone who'd already decided she wasn't worth the effort. Now she looked calm, like someone who'd finally stopped fighting battles she could never win. "There's something else," Webb said reluctantly. "I don't think you're going to like it." He slid another set of photographs across the desk. These showed Sophie at various social events, always accompanied by the same man, Dr. Lucas Rodriguez, a prominent cardiac surgeon at Mount Sinai. He was handsome in a way that spoke of substance rather than surface, with kind eyes and the sort of gentle confidence that came from saving lives for a living. "They're not sleeping together," Webb said quickly, recognizing the dangerous look that crossed Corbin's face. "I've been watching for 3 weeks. He picks her up for events, walks her to her door, and leaves. They're friends, maybe something developing, but it's not physical. Not yet." But Corbin was no longer listening. He was staring at a photograph of Sophie laughing at something Lucas had whispered in her ear, her face lit up with genuine joy in a way he'd never seen during 7 years of marriage. She looked young, carefree, like someone who'd rediscovered the possibility of happiness after convincing herself it was permanently out of reach. "When?" Corbin's voice was barely a whisper. "When do they meet?" "Usually Friday evenings for gallery openings or charity events. But sometimes—" Webb hesitated, then pushed forward with information he knew he shouldn't be sharing. "Sometimes he joins her for tea. The last 3 Thursdays, actually. They sit at her usual table and talk for hours." The revelation hit Corbin like artillery fire. Sophie's solitary tea ritual, the one thing that had seemed vulnerable, approachable, human, wasn't actually solitary anymore. She'd opened that private space to someone else, had allowed another man into the careful routine she'd built around her new life. "Tomorrow is Thursday," Corbin said, his voice carrying a strange calm that worried Webb more than desperate pleading would have. "Mr. Stubbs, I strongly advise against— I need to see her. I need to see them together. I need to understand what he gives her that I never could." Webb tried to talk him out of it, tried to explain that confronting Sophie in public would accomplish nothing except adding another viral humiliation to his growing collection. But Corbin was beyond rational argument, driven by an obsession that had consumed every rational thought and replaced them with the single desperate need to reclaim something he'd thrown away. As he left Webb's office, Corbin felt a strange sense of purpose for the first time in months. Tomorrow, he would see Sophie Queen in her new life, with her new man, in the place where she'd learned to be happy without him, and somehow, in his alcohol-damaged mind, he'd convinced himself that seeing her happiness would provide the key to destroying it, to proving that what they'd had was worth fighting for, to demonstrating that his love, however late, however selfish, was stronger than her contentment. He spent the night planning what he would say, how he would approach her, what words might crack the armor of indifference she'd built around herself. By morning, he'd convinced himself that this confrontation would be different, that seeing her with another man would finally provoke the reaction he'd been craving: anger, jealousy, some proof that she still cared enough to feel something when she looked at him. He was wrong, of course, but obsession has a way of making even intelligent men believe in fairy tales, especially when the alternative is accepting that some stories end not with reconciliation, but with one person learning to be happy while the other learns to live with the consequences of his choices. The irony was that Corbin had become exactly what he'd always claimed Sophie was during their marriage: desperate, needy, willing to sacrifice dignity for scraps of attention from someone who no longer wanted to give it. Tomorrow would be Thursday. Tomorrow, Sophie Queen would sit in her favorite cafe with a man who appreciated her company, while Corbin Stubbs would lurk in the shadows like a ghost haunting his own former life. And for the first time since this obsession began, he would finally understand that some love stories don't end with reunion. They end with one person learning to value themselves enough to close the door on those who had failed to see their worth when it mattered. What happened next would change everything forever. Chapter 10. The Tea Cafe Shock. Sometimes the heart's desperate gambles pay off in ways that have nothing to do with winning or losing, and everything to do with two broken people finally seeing each other clearly for the first time in years. The Blue Box Cafe inside Tiffany & Company existed in a world where everything was perfect, from the robin's egg blue walls to the delicate bone china that transformed afternoon tea into an art form. Fifth Avenue stretched beyond the windows like a river of possibility, while inside, conversations were conducted in the hushed tones reserved for sacred spaces and expensive mistakes. Sophie Queen sat at her usual corner table, a vision in navy cashmere that transformed the simple act of stirring tea into something approaching ballet. Across from her, Dr. Lucas Rodriguez watched her with the kind of patient attention that spoke of a man who'd learned to listen before speaking, to observe before judging, to value substance over surface. The Morrison Industries consultation is fascinating, Sophie was saying, her voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who'd rediscovered professional passion after years of having her insights dismissed or credited to someone else. They think their problem is structural engineering, but it's actually organizational psychology. The building failures are symptoms of communication breakdowns between departments that haven't spoken honestly in 5 years. Lucas smiled, the expression transforming his already handsome face into something that could have powered the cafe's chandeliers. You see everything as a puzzle to be solved, don't you? Even broken buildings become metaphors for broken relationships. Maybe that's why I'm good at fixing companies, but terrible at fixing marriages. The words came out lighter than Sophie intended, but she caught herself immediately. Sorry, I don't usually bring my personal disasters to tea. Your personal disasters led you to become the most sought-after consultant in Manhattan. I'd say you've managed the transition admirably. Sophie stirred her Earl Grey with mechanical precision, her mind wandering to places she usually kept locked during business hours. 6 months of transformation, 6 months of building a life that was entirely her own, and she was finally beginning to believe that happiness might be possible without the constant anxiety of trying to earn someone else's love. Lucas represented something she'd forgotten existed, the possibility of being valued for who she was rather than who someone else wanted her to become. He was brilliant without being arrogant, successful without being cruel, handsome without being vain. More importantly, he looked at her with genuine interest rather than the calculating assessment she'd grown accustomed to receiving from men who saw her beauty as a prize to be won rather than a person to be known. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you," Lucas said, his voice carrying the slight hesitation of someone approaching territory that might be marked with landmines. "Ask away." "The charity gala next Friday. Would you consider attending as my guest rather than just a colleague? I know we've been taking things slowly and I respect your need for space, but I'd like to explore the possibility of this becoming something more than friendship." Sophie's heart performed a small somersault that had nothing to do with caffeine and everything to do with the realization that she was ready to consider opening her heart to someone who might actually deserve the privilege. "Lucas, How dare you touch my wife?" The voice exploded through the cafe like a bomb detonating in a library. Every conversation stopped, every teacup froze halfway to lips, every head turned toward the source of the commotion that had just shattered the afternoon peace of Manhattan's most civilized establishment. Corbin Stubbs stood in the cafe's entrance like an avenging angel who'd lost his way and forgotten his purpose. His expensive suit hung on his frame like borrowed clothes. His hair was disheveled from running his hands through it during the 40-minute vigil he'd maintained outside Tiffany's, and his eyes blazed with the kind of desperate fury that came from months of obsession finally reaching critical mass. He moved toward their table with predatory focus, his attention locked on Lucas Rodriguez with the intensity of someone who'd found a target for rage that had been building since the night Sophie disappeared from his life. "Corbin." Sophie's voice was perfectly calm, the tone she might use to address a waiter who'd delivered the wrong order. "This is unexpected." But Corbin wasn't listening to Sophie. His entire focus was on the man sitting across from her, the man who dared to occupy the space that had once belonged to him, who had somehow earned the right to see Sophie's genuine smile, a privilege Corbin had possessed for 7 years and had been too blind to appreciate. "I said, get your hands off my wife." Corbin's voice carried across the cafe with enough volume to ensure that every patron, every employee, and every person within a city block would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. Lucas rose from his chair with the controlled movements of someone who dealt with agitated family members in hospital emergency rooms and understood that emotional volatility required careful handling. At 6'2", he had 4 inches on Corbin, but more importantly, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never needed to prove his worth through intimidation. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Corbin's laugh was sharp enough to cut crystal. "The misunderstanding is you thinking you can waltz into her life and play house with my wife while I'm still breathing." Before Lucas could respond, before Sophie could intervene, before anyone in the cafe could process what was happening, Corbin grabbed the front of Lucas's shirt and shoved him backward with the desperate strength of a man who'd lost everything else and was now reduced to fighting for scraps of a love that no longer existed. The cafe erupted in shocked gasps. Phones appeared like magic, their cameras capturing every second of what was rapidly becoming the most spectacular public meltdown in Tiffany and Company's recent history. Security guards materialized from hidden alcoves, moving toward the confrontation with professional urgency. "Corbin!" Sophie's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, finally carrying enough authority to penetrate his alcohol and obsession-fueled rage. "Stop this right now!" But Corbin wasn't capable of stopping. 6 months of rejection, 6 months of watching Sophie build a life that didn't include him, 6 months of realizing that the woman he'd called ugly had become magnificent while treating him like he'd never existed. All of it converged into this moment of public humiliation that felt like his last chance to matter in her story. "You don't understand," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation as security guards approached from both sides. "She's my wife, and I love her. I've loved her for 8 years, and I was too stupid to show it, but I love her." The cafe had fallen into complete silence, except for the soft click of phone cameras documenting every word. Sophie stood slowly, her movement drawing every eye in the room as she positioned herself between the two men who represented the before and after of her romantic life. "Wife?" Her voice was soft, but it carried through the silence with devastating clarity. "Which wife?" "Corbin." The question hit him like a physical blow. He stopped struggling against the security guards, his attention finally focusing completely on the woman who'd once loved him more than her own happiness. "Which wife?" she repeated, her green eyes holding his with the kind of intensity that made the rest of the cafe disappear. "The ugly one you married for convenience? The fat cow you couldn't wait to divorce? The woman you called ordinary while you planned Paris honeymoons with your mistress?" Each word was delivered with surgical precision, not screamed or shouted, but spoken with the calm authority of someone stating facts for the record. The cafe patrons leaned forward despite themselves, drawn into what was clearly the climax of a drama that had been building for months. Corbin's knees nearly buckled as he heard his own words thrown back at him, each cruel syllable a reminder of how thoroughly he'd destroyed something precious. "Sophie, Or do you mean the wife who tried for 7 years to earn your love? The one who worked 60-hour weeks to support your dreams while you took credit for her insights? The woman who lost your baby and needed comfort but got cruelty instead?" Tears began streaming down Corbin's face, each question a dagger that found its mark with devastating accuracy. The security guards hesitated, recognizing that this wasn't a simple case of a drunk customer causing trouble, but something more complex and painful unfolding in real time. "The only woman I ever loved," he whispered, his voice breaking completely. You're the only woman I ever loved, and I was too blind, too proud, too fucking stupid to see what I had until it was gone." For the first time since he'd exploded into the cafe, Sophie's composure cracked slightly, not because his words moved her, but because she finally saw something in his face that she'd never seen during their 7-year marriage. Complete honesty, not the calculated charm he'd used to win her in college, not the dismissive arrogance he'd developed during their marriage, not the desperate manipulation he'd attempted during his stalking campaign. Just raw, broken truth from a man who'd finally realized what he'd thrown away. "You love me?" Sophie's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the cafe, it might as well have been shouted from rooftops. "Now you love me? After I've learned to live without you? After I've built a life that makes me happy? After I've met someone who sees my worth?" She gestured toward Lucas, who stood watching this domestic drama unfold with the expression of someone who'd stumbled into someone else's tragedy and wasn't sure whether to flee or offer first aid. "Now you decide I'm worth fighting for? When I no longer need you to validate my existence? When I've finally learned to value myself the way you never could?" The questions hung in the air like accusations at a trial. Corbin looked into Sophie's face and saw not the desperate, love-starved woman he'd married, but someone who'd evolved beyond his reach, someone who'd learned to be complete without him. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he said, his voice carrying through the cafe with the weight of complete surrender. "I know I destroyed everything good between us. I know I called you ugly when you were beautiful, ordinary when you were extraordinary, worthless when you were the best thing that ever happened to me." He dropped to his knees in the middle of Tiffany's Blue Box Cafe, surrounded by Manhattan's elite, captured by dozens of cameras, reduced to the kind of public desperation that would follow him for the rest of his life. "But I see you now, Sophie. I see who you really are, who you always were, and I would give anything, my money, my business, my life, for one more chance to love you the way you deserve to be loved from the beginning." Sophie stared down at him for a long moment. This broken man who'd once controlled every aspect of her existence, who'd made her feel worthless and desperate and grateful for scraps of affection that should have been freely given. Then, slowly, she knelt down beside him, her movement causing a collective intake of breath from every person in the cafe. "Corbin," she said softly, her hand touching his face with the gentle precision of someone examining a wounded animal. "Look at me." He raised his eyes to meet hers, and for the first time in their 8-year history, they truly saw each other. Not the roles they'd played, not the expectations they'd failed to meet, not the people they'd pretended to be, but the damaged humans they actually were. "I forgive you," she whispered, and the words carried through the cafe like a benediction. "Not because you deserve it, but because I finally understand that you were as broken as I was. You just broke differently." Hope flickered in Corbin's eyes like a candle in a hurricane. "Does that mean—" "It means I forgive you for being exactly who you were when we met. A boy who'd never learned how to love anyone, including himself. And it means I'm grateful to you for destroying our marriage, because losing you taught me how to find myself." She stood up, her movement decisive and final. "But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation, Corbin. It just means I'm not going to carry your poison anymore." The hope in his eyes died as he realized that forgiveness could be more devastating than hatred, because it meant she cared enough to release him, but not enough to rebuild what they'd broken together. "Sophie, please." "Lucas," she said, turning to the man who'd watched this entire drama unfold with remarkable grace. "I believe you asked me a question earlier." Lucas stepped forward, his hand finding hers with the natural ease of someone who'd learned to appreciate what he'd been given rather than mourn what he'd lost. "I did. The answer is yes. I'd love to attend the gala with you, as your guest, not just your colleague." She looked back at Corbin one final time, her expression carrying not hatred or anger, but something that might have been pity mixed with genuine sadness for what they'd both lost. "Goodbye, Corbin. I hope you find someone who can love you better than I could, and I hope you learn to love them better than you loved me." As Sophie and Lucas walked toward the cafe's exit, past the silent patrons and clicking cameras, past the security guards and shocked employees, Corbin remained on his knees in the middle of Tiffany and company, surrounded by the wreckage of his public humiliation and the devastating realization that sometimes love arrives exactly when it's too late to matter. The cafe slowly returned to life around him, conversations resuming in hushed tones, but Corbin barely noticed. He'd finally told Sophie Queen the truth about how much he loved her, and she'd responded by choosing someone else, someone who'd learned to value her before he needed to beg for the privilege. Outside on Fifth Avenue, Sophie linked her arm through Lucas's and smiled up at him with the kind of genuine happiness that had nothing to do with her past and everything to do with the future she was finally brave enough to embrace. "That was," Lucas started. "Necessary," Sophie finished, "for both of us." As they walked toward their new beginning, Corbin Stubbs knelt alone in the place where his marriage had truly ended, not with lawyers or papers or bitter arguments, but with forgiveness that felt like funeral bells and the sound of a woman's heels clicking away from him forever. But was this truly the end, or just the beginning of a love stronger than betrayal? For Sophie Queen and Lucas Rodriguez, it was certainly a beginning. For Corbin Stubbs, kneeling in the ruins of his public humiliation, it was the end of one story, and perhaps, if he learned from his spectacular failures, the start of a journey toward becoming someone worthy of the love he'd been too blind to cherish when it was his to claim. Sometimes the greatest love stories are not about getting the person back, but about loving them enough to let them find happiness elsewhere. And finally, learning to love yourself enough to become someone capable of deserving love in return. The end.